This is how I paint a paneled door. For paint, I'm using a Benjamin Moore Advance in a satin sheen in the color of White Dove. But first, primer. I'm using a multi-purpose latex primer by Sherwin-Williams. Even though this door was factory primed, I'm going to reprime all the edges just to make sure they're sealed. Notice how I use my brush to smooth out the excess that pushes out on the front and back. I'm using 2 small blocks to keep the door from touching the floor, and a piece of masking paper stuck to the wall with blue tape lets me lean a single corner against the wall. After the edges are primed and the primer is dry, I sand every square inch of the door with 220 grit sandpaper. I always sand in the direction of the wood grain. Working systematically, I sand the bottom half of the door first, starting with the panels, and then the area around the panels, moving up the door as I go. Don't forget the skinny side edges or the other side of the door. The goal is to evenly scuff the entire door. Next, I use a shop vac with a brush attachment to methodically remove the powdery dust from top to bottom, down the edges, and on both sides. After that, I use a clean wet rag to wipe down the door panel by panel and from top to bottom. Be sure to turn the rag often and rinse it out when necessary. Still up on 2 blocks, one corner leaning on a piece of paper, the door is now ready to paint. I brush out the skinny side edges first. This time I use a wet rag to wipe away the excess from the front and back sides. Next, I move to the front and start with the top panel. I'm jamming my bristles into the corners to make sure they get painted. Once thoroughly coated, I use my brush to go around the panel and remove any excess paint that may be pooling or dripping. I finish each panel by carefully going around it like this with a wet rag to keep the edges neat. I do this for each panel all the way down the door, and I'm constantly checking my work for drips that may be forming. Next, I paint between the panels in the middle of the door. I do one manageable section at a time, being sure that my final brush strokes are in the direction of the wood grain, and making sure to keep paint from pooling in the corners of the panels. For the outer part around the door, I start at the doorknob hole and then go up and around the door until I meet the doorknob hole again. When I'm done, I check the whole side over for drips. Next, while holding the door from the very top edge and balancing the door on the top of my foot, I spin the door around so I can paint the other side. And here I just repeat what I did on the front side. Total time to brush out both sides is about 25 minutes. When I'm done, I leave the door in place to dry overnight. The next day, I review the door with my eyes and my hands for any dirt or debris that might have gotten in the paint or any runs or drips. Most of the time, these things can be addressed with a few gentle swipes with some sandpaper. If the first coat somehow had a lot of dirt in it, I wouldn't hesitate to re-sand, vac, and wipe the whole door. The second coat is just a repeat of the first. So I paint the skinny side edges, then panel by panel down the door, then the middle, then up and around from the doorknob hole back to the doorknob hole, checking my work over for drips as I go and before I flip the door to do the other side. By the next morning, the door looks great and it's ready to stack or hang. And that's how I paint a paneled door.